bed was so hard.
It's actually better for your back. Sorry.
Throughout history, beds have come in many different forms and been used for varying purposes. People have of course slept in them, but they've also dreamt in them, eaten in them, been intimate in them, given birth in them, ruled from them, and eventually died in them. Everywhere we've gone, we've made our beds to meet the needs of our local environment, and sometimes those needs have been completely unique to everything that's come before.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
So, this is a history of beds. But it's more than that. It's a history of what humans do and have done in the third of our lives that we spend in them. This is a history of bedtime. Part 1. The beds. When NASA was figuring out the minutiae of space travel, one of the key considerations was how the astronauts would sleep. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would be fine when they got to the moon, because the moon's gravity would ensure that they could sleep in hammocks in the lunar module. But on the way there, they would have to tackle sleep in zero gravity. This presented tired astronauts with two major problems. The first, and arguably the most obvious, was that if you fell asleep in zero gravity, there was a high chance you'd bump into something. The second, and the slightly more worrying of the two, was that if you fell asleep in zero gravity, a carbon dioxide bubble can form around your head from your breathing, meaning you wake up choking, or just don't wake up. To combat this, astronauts sleep in a ventilated room, which has a sleeping bag attached to the wall so you don't float off. The Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield has even made a video about it.
This is my sleep station, my sleep pod. This is where I spend up to 8 hours every day, here on board the space station. It's actually on the floor, but once you're inside you just can't tell.
The sleeping arrangements of astronauts are made unique by their circumstances. Alongside the obvious concerns of sleeping in zero gravity, astronauts aboard the ISS experience 16 sunrises and sunsets every day. There's nothing quite like it to upset the circadian rhythms. But most societies haven't had to think about zero gravity whilst designing their beds. Before we tamed fire around 2 million years ago, our most ancient ancestors probably slept in trees like chimpanzees do today. This put them out of reach of predators on the ground, but fire did the same thing, so when they learned to control it, they came down from the trees and slept close to the hearth. At this point, their beds would have just been little piles of grass or a hide near the fire. Other than warmth and comfort, these early societies had to deal with insects and pests irritating them while they tried to sleep. The earliest beds we have evidence of suggest that Homo sapiens lay their beds on a layer of ash and mixed the grass with leaves from the Cape Laurel tree. This warded off insects. They also burned the bedding regularly to keep their sleeping places hygienic. There were local variations on grass bedding as well. A compact mat of grass held together and protected by a clay-like substance was discovered in a site in Israel. It dated back to about 27,000 years ago. The substance it had been covered in allowed it to survive. Elsewhere in the world, in Texas, holes filled with grass and big enough to curl up in were found in a cave. They date back some 9,000 years. So for hundreds of thousands of years, the human idea of a bed consisted pretty much of a big pile of grass near a fire. It's probably not a spoiler at this point for me to tell you that things wouldn't stay like that forever. Around 3200 BC, we see the first appearance of the bed frame. Well, sort of. These were the beds of Stone Age farmers, and they don't look particularly cosy at first, but if you fill them full of hides, they don't look that bad. All the houses in Skara Bray have two beds surrounding a central hearth, one on the left wall and one on the right wall, and for some reason, the one on the right wall is always larger. Historians have speculated as to why this was, but we just don't know. Holes in the wall surrounding some of these bed boxes suggest that maybe there were rails there once that held up curtains. It would definitely be a good way to keep in warmth, or keep out sunlight. It was around this point in human history that societies began to become rigidly stratified, and the resulting social inequality led to the first appearance of beds with legs. We have some evidence of beds with legs in the art of the isolated societies that lived on the islands of Malta and Gozo around 3500 to 2500 BC. Unfortunately, in the absence of written records, we really just don't know much about them. Early Egyptian beds we do know more about, and for the rich they weren't that different from most people's beds today. They had wooden frames with legs and a sleeping platform made of leather, cloth or reeds. There were some differences, as many of these beds sloped downwards with a footrest at the lower end, like the bed of Queen Hetepheres from around 2580 BC. Over 1,000 years later, Tutankhamun was put to rest with 9 beds in his tomb, and most of them have the same downward slope as Queen Hetepheres' bed. The pharaoh would have rested his neck against an ornate headrest rather than using a pillow like we do today. Moving to ancient Greece, beds become a lot more familiar. The footboard is replaced by a headboard, and pillows replace the hard ivory headrests of Tutankhamun's day. These beds were called clinae, and the Romans based the design of their own beds on them. The Roman lectus cubicularis was, as you can see, very similar to the clinae. Its name comes from the Latin lectus for bed, and cubicularis meaning bedroom, but Romans had lots of different types of beds meant for different purposes. One of them, the lectus genialis, meant the marriage bed. Halfway across the world in ancient China, raised beds arrived somewhere between the 13th and 11th centuries BC. They were popularized by the arrival of Buddhism around 200 AD, as the Buddha was depicted as sitting on a raised platform. This led to beds for the rich becoming so tall that one woman supposedly attempted to throw herself off one as an act of self-harm. We can have some idea of what these beds look like from an 8th century copy of a painting that was created at some point in the 4th century. The emperor's bed is depicted as being raised off the floor, with 4 posts holding up a canopy of fine fabrics above the hard sleeping platform. Even today, sleeping on hard surfaces is common in China, and for most of history that's where the majority of Chinese people slept. One example of this is the Chinese kang, which could be heated like a stove to keep the sleepers warm. These were big pieces of furniture that could take up the majority of a room. Not all rich people elsewhere slept on raised beds either. In Constantinople, the Ottoman Sultan slept on a low platform covered with rugs and cushions, and Japan saw most people sleeping on the ground into the modern era. From around the 8th century AD, they slept on tatami, straw mats which covered the entire floor of a room, and later on in the 17th century the futon was introduced. This cotton mattress was stuffed with batting and placed atop the tatami for extra warmth. In medieval Europe, peasants would sleep on hay wrapped in blankets or cloaks. Bedsteads were the province of the rich, although this began to change into the early modern era. In the late 17th century, you could expect to find a bedstead and a mattress in the house of an English weaver, small farmer or poor artisan, although you weren't likely to find any sheets. This still depended on where you lived though, as most poor Scottish and Irish families slept on the floor on piles of straw, rushes and heather, although some of the better off poor could afford a flock bed with a sheet and blanket. But that was usually reserved for the husband and wife, leaving the rest of the family to lie on straw. Medieval servants might have things a little better depending on whose servants they were. In some manor houses, they would often sleep on simple pallet beds, essentially wooden boxes with low legs that could be moved about when needed. Elsewhere, they might sleep on straw mattresses with a sheet above them, although the straw would often prick through the canvas of the mattress, making a good night's sleep difficult. Apprentices and journeymen tended to sleep wherever they could on the floor of their master's shops, although journeyman bakers in early modern Paris were apparently able to sleep in empty flour sacks on top of warm stoves, which was a sleeping arrangement not unlike the Chinese kang mentioned earlier. Shifting up the wealth pyramid, the humblest bed of a late medieval aristocrat was likely to look something like this. First you would have a bedstead. Atop this would be placed a litter of straw after first being shaken to remove the dust. The straw would be replaced once every 1 to 3 months, depending upon availability and the wealth of the aristocrat. A border also had to be placed around the straw to keep it from falling off the bed. Canvas was then placed over the straw to stop it poking through to the other, softer layers of bedding. Atop that was placed a mattress which, beginning around the mid-16th century, was legally required to be stuffed with feathers, wool or flock. Optionally, a feather bed could be placed atop the mattress, which was similarly required to be stuffed with feathers or down. A feather bed was considered a luxury and was also a status symbol, and it was softer than the more standard, firmer mattress. Atop the mattress, or feather bed if there was one, was a blanket, 2 sheets, and another blanket. You would get in between the 2 sheets, which were referred to as the nether sheet and the oversheet, with the nether sheet on the bottom. And in richer households, the blankets may be replaced with fustians, a fabric woven with linen warp and cotton weft, which was more expensive than standard blankets. Similarly, sheets could be swapped out for the more expensive sheets of Rennes, which were literally plain weave linen sheets made in Rennes. Finally, a bolster would be placed at the top of the bed to rest the head on, with a headsheet wrapped around it. If you were really rich though, beds would have many more elements. Firstly, you'd cover the top blanket in a coverlet and put some pillows on the bolster. coverlets were pieces of fabric intended to cover the rest of the bed. They were made to be pretty and decorated with various patterns like crowned lions, dragons, and other symbols of significance. Despite their relative attractiveness, they weren't the most expensive part of the bed. In one chamber, the coverlet had a value of 1 shilling and sixpence, whilst the mattress was over 3 shillings and the canvas cost 10 shillings. Moving up to the pillows, they generally came in sets of 1 or 2, although just 1 pillow to a bed was most usual. If there was a pillow and a bolster on the same bed, the pillow would be put atop the bolster, although they could sometimes replace a bolster as well. Whilst bolsters were stuffed with feathers, or supposed to be at least, pillows were stuffed with down, and I just want to point out that we know this because of a complaint by the Worshipful Company of Upholsterers in the 15th century that some disreputable merchants were selling various items of bedding like feather beds and pillows, and stuffing them with the sort of things that you wouldn't want to find inside your pillow, like sand and gravel. That being said, pillows were seen by some as effeminate, and occasionally men would choose to sleep with a harder pillow instead, like a log. For most though, pillows were soft, and when they existed the head sheet would be wrapped around them, rather than the bolster. Then you would have the tester, which was an extended board at the head of the bed. Directly above the bed's occupants would be a canopy referred to as a scylla or hilling. It's hard to tell exactly what the difference between a scylla and a hilling was, but you occasionally find them mentioned as being in the same bed set, suggesting that they had different purposes. It is possible that a hilling was sturdier than a scylla, and that the scylla was a cloth canopy which would be attached to the hilling or supported by rails or beams. Some beds also contained curtains, which covered both sides and the bottom of the bed. When there was a canopy, the curtains were attached around the edge or below it, and when there wasn't, a rail was hung from the ceiling or attached to the walls for the curtains to hang from. I skipped over the actual bedstead itself, but it's worth mentioning that although bedding was often gifted in wills, bedsteads weren't. They came up in inventories and various drawings, so we know they definitely existed and made up a standard part of the bed, but generally they were big heavy objects which were difficult to move and took up a lot of space. There wasn't really a reason to gift a bedstead to someone who already had one, so we just sit around taking up room, so they were usually simply left where they were, whilst the bedding that would go with it, which was expensive and would become worn over time, were gifted instead. What did this look like in practice, you ask? Something like this. The Great Bed of Ware was designed around 1590 and was about twice the size of a modern double bed, making it much bigger than the average four-poster. It was quite a tourist attraction for the inns which kept it over the years, and many who slept in it left their initials in its surface. In the 19th century, it had ended up in Hoddesdon, and stayed there until 1931 when the Victoria and Albert Museum in London bought it for £4,000, allowing them to make this video, which I shall link into the description below if you want to see the rest of it. Four-poster beds are the favourites of anyone wishing to portray the sleeping chambers of medieval kings in media. In The Dragon Prince, it's where King Harrow sleeps, and in Merlin, King Uther sleeps in one. Various other media with medieval settings show the beds of royalty to be four-posters, but four-posters were not found all throughout the medieval era. They slowly evolved from hard boards covered in furs or quilts, which could be assembled pretty much anywhere. The place where the bed was made was called the stead, and when the bedstead developed into a single piece of furniture, the name stuck. Curtains were eventually hung from the ceiling around some beds in the Norman period, and the canopy and tester were finally introduced in the 13th century. It was only in the 15th century that the four-poster, combining the whole ensemble of a bedstead, four posts, curtains, a tester and a canopy, was introduced to England, although it probably came from Austria. So, King Uther, whose Camelot exists at the same time as the Kingdom of Mercia, well before the 15th century, would likely not have slept in a four-poster. But then, he probably wouldn't have had to deal with dragons in his basement either. Regardless, beds were usually the most expensive things inside the house of a late medieval aristocrat well into the early modern period, and having a spare one was seen as something to be proud of. So when Shakespeare gave his wife his second best bed, he wasn't disparaging her, but giving her one of his most valuable possessions. It was also almost certainly their marriage bed, as the best bed was usually put in the main living space to impress visitors. When Europeans started heading over to America in the early modern period, their beds usually mirrored the style from wherever they had come from, although often more restrained. So English folk who headed over would sleep with thick piled bed covers, whilst the Dutch favoured the box beds common in the Netherlands in the 17th century, which were usually built into walls or, more rarely, were standalone furniture. As the 19th century arrived, modernisation saw cleaner, lighter bedding set atop factory-made iron bedsteads become more common. The English textile designer William Morris made bed hangings with lighter cotton fabrics to replace the heavier wools and fragile silks of old. However, many rich folks kept their four-posters, including Morris himself, and the high household standards in middle and upper-class households required the daily turning of mattresses and twice-daily changing of pillowcases. The rigours of this meant that most of the better-off sort had to keep servants to keep up. But this began to change after the horrors of World War I saw the gradual destruction of the old hierarchical system of staff and servants in the West, and the sudden lack of available maids made tending the needs of complex beds a higher price to pay than it had been in the pre-war world. But it wasn't until the 1970s, when the British designer Terence Conran discovered the Swedish duvet and popularised it, that beds could finally be made in just a few seconds, which had the effect not only of making good quality beds cheap, but also relegated them to the margins of our lives, hidden away and uncommented on despite being our most used piece of furniture. However, there is a great deal to say about our relationship with beds throughout history, chiefly about how we have slept in them. People of the past generally knew that sleeping was good for your health. One Chinese proverb declares that a full night's sleep is better than taking ginseng, and in 1612 a Welsh writer wrote that sleep strengtheneth all the spirits, comforteth the body, quieteth the humours, taketh away sorrow, and assuageth the fury of the mind. However, there were dangers associated with sleep as well. In his 1609 book, School of Good Manners, the English translator William Fiston called his bed a prototype for his grave, and in Hesiod's Theogony, one of the earliest texts of ancient Greek mythology, the goddess of the night, Nyx, bore the god of sleep, Hypnos, and the god of death, Thanatos, signifying their close relationship in the minds of the Greeks. There were plenty of examples of people dying in their beds for early modern Europeans to point to, and the danger of this led to a number of pre-bedtime rituals throughout Europe. Like today, windows, doors and shutters would be double-checked to make sure that they were shut and locked, as were chamber doors in an attempt to keep out the nighttime air, which was thought by many to cause ill health. If a home had curtains, they needed to be drawn to keep out the moonlight, which was similarly associated with rheumatic diseases. Bedsheets could never be damp from washing due to the risks of ill health that presented, and in very cold weather, beds were warmed with copper pans of coals or hot stones wrapped in rags. Fires were put out to ensure that sleep wasn't interrupted by a potentially fatal house fire, and some people even recited verses in order to charm their hearths. One Latvian verse went, "Sleep, my fire, like a mouse in a nest," and English families would sometimes mark a cross in the ashes before praying. If all of this proved futile, rural households in France kept holy water near their beds, and in Anjou, a pail of water was left in the kitchen overnight to allow a soul to cleanse itself after death. When all this was accomplished, families would still need to hunt for fleas and bedbugs in furniture and bedding, and pick lice from their hair, clothing and skin. Gnats, which could be just as irritating, were kept at bay in East Anglia by hanging cow dung at the foot of the beds. Spiritual dangers also needed to be kept at bay, and some poorer households would perform magic spells when preparing for bed, often intended to prevent nightmares. An early Welsh verse went, "No ill dream shall vex his bed, hell's dark land he ne'er shall tread," and throughout Europe, turning over your shoes at the foot of the bed was considered a way to prevent bad dreams. Group prayer was also a key part of the bedtime routine, and by the 1500s it was the family patriarch's responsibility for conducting them every night. In households that could afford servants, the servants would also join in. These prayers gave thanks for spiritual guidance, requested peaceful sleep, and asked forgiveness for moral failings, as well as asking for divine protection from nocturnal harm. One medieval verse went, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep." When all this was done, it was finally time to get into bed. By the 16th century, the upper and middle classes would likely be dressed in smocks, whilst the less fortunate wore coarse clothing, slept naked, or remained in day clothes, either to save on the cost of blankets or for the ability to rise quickly in the morning. However, things weren't over yet. Bed sharing was very common in the medieval and early modern world. It was not uncommon for beds to be shared, especially among the poorer sort, but even better off folks might share a bed when they went abroad. Because of how common bed sharing was, there was a set of well-understood conventions when it came to the practice. Like might be expected in the modern day, a good bedfellow would lie still, keep to themselves, and not pull away the blankets. Talking was permitted, but it was expected that you would not go on when your bedfellow wished for sleep, as can be seen from a passage from the diary of Samuel Pepys on Wednesday the 5th of April 1665. "And Creed lay with me, but, being sleepy, he had no mind to talk about business, which indeed I intended by inviting him to lie with me, but I would not force it on him, and so to bed he and I, and to sleep. By the 18th century, however, the better off would sometimes view communal sleep with some disdain, as personal privacy grew to be more important. Even religious leaders condemned the morality of families who slept in common beds. However, as late as the mid-19th century, Abraham Lincoln would travel with judges and lawyers on the circuit of courthouses, sleeping 2 in a bed and 8 in a room. Lincoln himself often shared his bed with Joshua Speed, which some have taken to mean that he was gay, but whatever his true sexuality, it's not likely that he was engaging in 8-way orgies every night. Bed sharing had significant benefits. Sleeping beside someone familiar added a sense of security, not to mention warmth, and sharing a bed with someone resulted in a level of intimacy rare for daytime relationships. 2 men sharing a bed may bare their souls to one another, and were more likely to care for each other when sick and share their secrets. Bedfellows were also more likely to break social barriers. In the 1671 book The English Rogue, a mistress who usually shares her bed with a maidservant is very free and open with her, and female servants could even afford protection from abusive husbands by sleeping with their mistresses. Large families would often assign spots in bed according to age and sex. Daughters would sleep next to their mothers and sons by the father. The eldest daughter would sleep against the wall furthest from the door, and visitors and strangers lay at the edges. However, in a practice known as bundling, unmarried young people of the opposite sex were allowed to sleep next to each other in bed to judge potential compatibility, with just a partition known as a bundling board put down in the centre of the bed. This is a practice still present in some ultra-conservative groups like the Schwarzentruber Amish, who allow the couple to bundle on the condition that they remain fully clothed, engage in no touching, and talk all night. Co-sleeping is in fact still common in many societies. The Japanese, for example, call it soine, and value the security it brings. But eventually sleep has to come, and with it, dreams. But that is a subject for next time. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to leave a like and subscribe for future content, and if you want to support the channel further, then check out my Patreon in the description of the video, and I'll see you next time when we'll be looking at the history of dreams.